Hello, and welcome to our virtual event, Starting Your Storytelling Journey. My name is Brooke Campbell, and I'm the Acting Director of Programs at Canada's National History Society. I'm so excited to be joined by all of you, and I'm honored to be able to introduce this session. Canada's National History Society acknowledges that we meet and work across the ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. I am streaming this from Canmore, Alberta, which is part of Treaty 7 territory, the ancestral lands of the Stoney Nakoda, Blackfoot Confederacy, and Tsuut'ina Nations. Canmore is in the mountains of Alberta, and historically, this area has been a traditional gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. Many of the mountains and the landscapes that surround me are sacred places and hold really special meaning. And I am grateful to be able to walk this journey of learning and honoring these connections to the land. It has been a very exciting year here at Canada's National History Society with the launch of our latest youth program called #Our Stories, Our Voices. And we are grateful to the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support in this program. Now, throughout today's presentation, I hope you will be inspired to find histories in your communities and create your own stories to share with others. You can submit your stories to Canada's National History Society as part of the #Our Stories, Our Voices national contest for a chance to win a seat at a virtual youth forum this summer. So today, think about what stories you might be interested in telling and how you might want to share them. We are also hosting a prize draw for teachers. Each submission from your students will go to, each submission from your students into the contest will enter your name into our draw for a chance to win a $75 cash prize to go towards your classroom. So the deadline for this contest is Friday, December 17th. And I think we're going to put the links in the chat for you to find some more information and all of the details for that. For today's event, we will be having a Q&A session with our speaker after her presentation. So you'll see that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a Q&A little button. And if you click that, you can type in your questions. So please feel free to add questions throughout the presentation, and we will ask them during the dedicated time at the end. If there's any questions that you especially want answered, you can upvote that question by clicking on the thumbs up. You can also leave comments and engage in the discussion using the chat box. And I wanted to let you know that we are recording today's presentation and we'll be sharing it online after. So please feel free to ask your questions anonymously. Without further ado, today's event features a presentation from Nancy Payne, editor of Kayak, Canada's history magazine for kids, and contributing editor at Canada's History. She came to us after being the editor for the adult and children's publications at the Canadian Wildlife Federation and a producer for CBC Radio in Ottawa. And Nancy lives near Lindsay, Ontario, getting all my names muddled up together now. We will also be joined today by a member of the Canada's History Youth Committee, Christine Jean-Julien, who will help facilitate today's Q&A session. So at this time, I would love to welcome Nancy and to invite her to begin her presentation.
Hey everyone, it's great to be with you. I am super lucky because I get to work with the stories of Canada all the time. I think it's a great gig to get paid to learn about Canada's history and to tell those stories. So I'm going to share a few suggestions with you today, and they may help you to figure out what story you want to tell. Désolé que je parle pour la plupart en anglais, mais je ne suis pas vraiment bilingue, mais j'espère de répondre en français si c'est possible. Et encore, désolé pour ça. At Kayak, where I've been for about 10 years, we choose a theme for every issue. So we pick a particular subject that we want to dive into, and we do all our stories about that subject. We do factual stories, we do little tidbits, we do profiles, but we also do factually based comics, des bandes dessinées, and fiction stories with original illustrations. So we find different ways to treat different parts of the same theme. And you might wonder, after 10 years, do you start to run out of ideas? And the reality is not in the slightest. If anything, I get even more ideas all the time, and I'm constantly sending myself emails or writing down notes because stories are all around us. And sometimes we get caught up in the idea that we have to tell the big stories, the big sweeping stories of Canada. But my background is journalism. And when I came to this job, I realized that Canada's history is made up of our stories, of the stories that are all around us. So honestly, it just takes a bit of a different way of thinking. You just have to pay attention to what's around you. Here's some specific ideas. Look around at very ordinary things. Pose des questions. Who is your school named after? Or if it's named after a place, how did that place get its name? What if you're covered by a treaty territory, a treaty where you live? What's the story of how that treaty came to be? Who was involved? Who wasn't involved? You start asking questions about the things that are around you. Maybe your town's on a lake, or you live near a river. Who used that river? What kind of boats did they use? Who vacationed on that lake? Suddenly you start to realize that everywhere you look, there are stories that you can tell. Another great way to find ideas is to visit museums or historic sites. I love doing this, and I did it long before I was an editor of a history magazine, and I have a big file in my mind of ideas that came from these places. In fact, the photo on the left there is from when I went with one of my sons on a field trip to a site in central Ontario near where I live, the Sainte Marie among the Hurons, Sainte Marie aux Hurons. About fur trade, about Jesuit priests, and I learned a lot just from being a parent on that trip. On the right is a time when we went to a reenactment for the War of 1812. And when you get talking to people and you ask the curator or the interpreters or the reenactors, you ask them questions, they're going to tell you some really neat stories, because chances are that's what got them interested too. For instance, the War of 1812 is pretty cool, just as a big subject, but I love the stories of Laura Secord or Billy Green, the scout. They really bring those stories home to me. You can also talk to the people in your life, your parents, your grandparents, neighbors. I mean, I'm a lot older than you, but when I got talking to my dad about the Second World War, he told me about what it was like hearing the air raid sirens and how terrifying that was when they thought there might be a bombing raid where he lived. My mom grew up north of where I live here, just around the time of the Depression or just afterward. I've never forgotten the story she told me about how her family really didn't have much money. So her mom made their underwear out of the sacks the flour came from. I mean, you talk about the Depression in a big way, I might be kind of like, oh, that's interesting. But you talk about something like that, about having to go to school and you're wearing underwear that was made from flour sacks, that really sticks with you. So talk to people and ask questions. Of course, there's more obvious things you can do. Pick up a book that interests you and read it. I've shown some here from different age ranges, but again, look for the stuff that interests you and read up more about it. Profiles of individuals, whether you're peut-être vous êtes intéressé au sujet des sports, des Canadiens de Montréal, ou la mode, or maybe you're interested in cooking. There's a story behind all of those things. I'm also a huge believer in travel, in seeing different parts of the country. Just for example, on the upper right there, c'est la ville du Québec. My husband and I went there for a few days. We love Quebec City. And this is a statue of Cartier that's kind of away from the main, some of the more popular tourist areas. And that's my husband sitting reading the paper. He's a Francophone, and he was very interested in some of the inscriptions on here about that. I took pictures of them to use later, about some of the things Cartier said about working with people of all races and religions. That was pretty interesting to me. On the left, that's Val-Marie, Saskatchewan, which is right near Grasslands National Park. And when I traveled there with some of with my brother and sisters a few years ago, I was really interested in the history behind grasslands because we come from a farm background, and it was really interesting seeing the old farmhouses kind of crumbling into nothing. And it makes you think, who were some of the people that farmed that area? What were some of the difficulties they had, or what did they learn? Or there are teepee rings there that go back to time immemorial. And on a similar note, on the bottom right, that's a photo of a cemetery, a burial ground from a visit I made to a place called Cormorant Island off the coast of BC in the community of Alert Bay. And the cemetery had totem poles in it. And I also learned that when those totem poles fall, they're often just left to go back to nature. And again, that was something, all of these things have stuck with me, and they're going to make their way into future magazines and stories that I write. I can guarantee you that. But okay, so I talked about seeing all different parts of Canada, which is amazing. It's been impossible or very hard for quite a while now, for almost 2 years. So keep in mind that you don't have to travel that far. I'm just going to show you an example literally from right around the area where I live. I also do some work for a local magazine here in my area. And I thought, you know what? None of us can travel very far. I'm going to go out and just explore what's interesting about our area that we don't pay enough attention to. I thought I'd maybe do one. I ended up doing 4 of these articles on this very ordinary piece of Ontario where I live. So I'd heard about these stone fences or dry stone walls that were built about half an hour north of me. So I added it to the list, looked it up online, couldn't find a whole lot of information, but at least I got the location. So then when I drove up around there, I found the actual plaque about this guy, George Laidlaw, who made his money first as a merchant and then with the railway, and bought a ton of land up there and wanted to run cattle on this big ranch. And he decided that he wanted to bring over a special stone expert from Scotland, and this is like the late 1800s, to build this very specific type of stone fence or stone wall, because it takes a very skilled artisan to do it. So I drove up there, and first I saw the ones that were kind of falling down and overgrown, and then you keep going and you see kilometers of these fences that have been built both by the artisan, by people being taught the skill, and then others who have just kept expanding and expanding them. So they're this very interesting, distinctive feature of this area. And that became an article, a little piece of that. It was just literally about, you can see we called it Backyard Tourist. And I just spent some time paying more attention to the area where I live. Places you go by all the time, they all have stories. You just have to see it with new eyes. And like I say, ask questions about them. But okay, maybe you don't drive. Maybe you don't think you can go that far afield on your own. Well, you know what? Do some research online and just try some interesting terms for things that you would like to know more about, and just add the word history, or just try different combinations of words. So here's a random one I just tried for the purposes of this presentation. I typed in famous Chinese Canadian Calgary. I thought, let's see what that turns up. And it turns out really cool guy comes up that I'd never heard of, this person named Norman Kwong. And look at that. He was not only the first Lieutenant Governor of Alberta of Asian descent, he was also the first Canadian of Chinese descent to play in the CFL. Now, I'd want to double check all those facts, but wow, what an interesting thing to run across just from some pretty random search terms. So that might get you thinking about in your community, in things that interest you. Like I say, whether it's sports, whether it's fashion, c'est la musique, c'est les personnes intéressantes. From your community, what would you like to know more about? I did the same thing on YouTube. I thought, okay, I hear some random words, PEI, history, and animal. Look what came up. There's a video about how it was that skunks came to PEI. I think that would make for a really interesting story. And again, that's something I'm going to file away to maybe think about in future. We did a whole issue of Kayak about animals, and the stories were fascinating about Sergeant Bill, who was a goat, who was the mascot for a Saskatchewan battalion in the First World War and actually won medals for his service. Beautiful Joe, who was a dog who'd been beaten and was the inspiration for this incredibly beloved children's book. from around the turn of the 20th century. So take something that interests you and dive in a little deeper, and you're going to find some fascinating stories, whether they're in your community, whether they're online, whether they're in a book, whether they're from talking to people. There's tons of them out there, trust me. So once you have your story, what would you like to do with it? And like I say, a story could be anything. It doesn't have to be the written word. So here's just some suggestions for things you might want to think about. I used to love writing poetry. I think poetry works best when you're retelling something that's a dramatic event that has emotion associated with it, or that evokes strong feelings in you, because I think those are the best subjects for something like a poem. So you might start from a historical story. One of the most famous is the expulsion of the Acadians in Atlantic Canada, and prompted a very famous poem called Evangeline. So those are some things to keep in mind if you're thinking about a poem. Of course, if you like music, write a poem, it becomes lyrics, and you can set it to music. That would be an awesome entry. Fiction stories are a really great thing to do. You can start again with interesting events, because you're probably going to need an interesting plot, and you can then use that as the basis for your story. So for instance, the Halifax explosion you might have heard of. That would be kind of not something you'd necessarily want to show a visual of, but for instance, that became a fiction story for Kayak, because apparently there were huge numbers of injuries in after the Halifax explosion that came as a result of flying glass from windows. All kinds of people, children, were blinded, and that was struck me as a really powerful story that was made more powerful, I think, using a fictional format, inventing some characters to tell that story. But I wouldn't use it as the subject of a comic, because I don't think that's something you want to spend a lot of time drawing or looking at, those kinds of injuries. Here's another fiction story from an issue about Confederation. Le Journal de Mercy Coles. Mercy Coles was the daughter of someone who was at the Confederation discussions and parties and balls and things in Prince Edward Island. So somebody wrote a fiction story based on a real person, based on her actual journals, but imagining what she might have been going through. So those are some ideas for a fiction story. I come from a radio background, and I think a podcast or an audio recording could also be a really cool way to tell a story. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm out of order. So we'll talk about the podcast, and I'll come back to essays. Podcasts, or anything that you want to do just as a story that you hear, those will be really effective if they have sound associated with them. So maybe it's a story of something happening on the ocean, and you can use the sounds of waves and seagulls and those kinds of things. Maybe it's one of my favorites, the story of the Saskatchewan baseball player, Bonnie Baker, who joined the league that came up during the Second World War that was all women playing professional baseball. There are lots of Canadians in that league, by the way. And think about how great that would be to have the sound of the crowds and the bats and a ball being hit and cheering and the ball smacking a glove. That would be really cool to listen to as you tell your story. It would just kind of enliven it. You can always do an essay. I think those probably work best if you're somebody who really enjoys doing research and you have a strong point of view about what you're writing about. I think that will just help you make that even more interesting for your audience, and use the research as the starting point to make an argument, to describe something that you feel strongly about. Some other formats that you might consider, videos are a ton of fun and really, really rewarding. If you've ever done one, you know they're also a ton of work. If you want the visuals to be effective, I mean, si vous habitez à Québec ou à St. John's, vous avez beaucoup de scènes intéressantes, historiques. But, you know, if you don't live in Quebec City or St. John's and you want to set something in a place with old buildings, you'd better have that nearby or a way to get there. Excuse me. You will have to think about costumes and the lighting. You know, can you shoot everything you need in one day, or do you need to go back? And what if the weather's different? And obviously that takes time to edit that. But like I say, very, very satisfying project. but it might take another person to help you do the shooting if you want to be in it. You might need other people to be extras. So just keep in mind that you've got all those elements if you want to do a video. And then lastly, one of my favorites is, in English, we'd call it a comic, but it's got even a longer tradition in French, as des bandes dessinées. These are great if you have lots of action, because they're more enjoyable to kind of draw if you've got action and movement versus people just sort of talking to each other. This also gives you the really fun choice to explore kind of an alternate reality. Something that wouldn't happen in real life, so that you couldn't really show on a video because you couldn't really film it. You can create just in your own imagination. So if you want to have time travelers, if you want to do things that, have two historic figures talk to each other, that would be a little tricky to do on video, but you can just draw a picture of it. And here's one we did that I really liked. It's the story you may have heard of La Chasse-Galerie, the Quebec folktale of the, it doesn't translate exactly, but sort of almost the haunted canoe, something like that. It's about a group of lumberjacks who essentially pay a very high price to the devil so that they can go and go to parties with their families and the people they love on New Year's Eve. So you'll see on the right-hand side there, you've got the flying canoe with kind of the devilish tail behind it. They're flying over historic buildings in Quebec. And you can you get that red of the devil in there. You've got different points of view. You couldn't do that with a video, and it would be hard to describe in words. But when you do bande dessinée or comic, you can do whatever you want. Again, you want to do some research first to get your details right, but then it's honestly just up to your imagination how you decide to approach that. So lots of different ways you can tell your stories all around you. Now, what do you do just to make sure that it is a good reflection of reality? So it's really important to make sure that your story, whatever format you choose, is grounded in the facts. So I'm just going to quickly run through some different sources you might think about using and some things to consider. And again, I come from a journalism background, so I'm always going to tell you to check your facts. The thing is, surprisingly enough with history, you can't always guarantee something, but you can do as much research as possible to satisfy yourself that you've got a credible factual basis for what you're talking about. So I think you know a lot of this stuff, but I just want to kind of flag it for you. So you might find some interesting ideas on, say, social media. So places like, somebody might mention something cool on TikTok. My niece sent me a cool TikTok about Harriet Tubman that was really interesting. That's a starting point. You might read something neat on Reddit if you're one of those people. That's a starting point. You might go, okay, I'm going to go learn more about that. You will also find online media sources. This is just one I picked that I know has very, very strong, what we call partisan opinions. If you see an online source that's really ridiculing another point of view or kind of sneering at it, or you think it might be choosing facts just to support its point of view, that's not a credible source. So you can pick an idea up from one of these, but don't ever take it anywhere else without double checking it. Now, there's some other sources that you might use, but again, they're not reliable enough to use just on their own. Wikipedia is something we all use. It's a great starting point. It's not completely reliable in and of itself. I love the story of the person who invented a war, created a fictitious paper that described that war and just kind of did a whole bunch of circular links. It stayed on Wikipedia for 5 years without anybody ever figuring out that it wasn't true, that it never happened. But there were probably people in their schoolwork over that time. By all means, check out Wikipedia, but then go and double check with one of the credible sources we're going to talk about in a minute. And then there are also things where you'll find people talking about history because they're interested in it. It's a personal, say a personal blog particularly, or personal Instagram or Twitter feed, whatever. Again, good starting point. You can provide some interesting ideas that you say, oh, that's worth checking out. But unless it's a historian, don't rely on a blog or things like a Twitter stream. as authoritative, because they're not. Historians, even those you might want to check, because they may come to it with a particular point of view, and you may want to just double check that that's in fact a completely accurate representation of something. But if you think it's just somebody who's interested in history, there's a neat site called Atlas Obscura that points to a lot of really cool places to visit in Canada. I love that site, but I would never take it as authoritative in and of itself. It's not enough on its own to be reliable, because they're just people writing about stuff that interests them. They're not necessarily checking their facts all that carefully. So then what is a credible source? What is a good place to do your research? There are tons, fortunately. Again, as a journalist, I'm always going to tell you, you should still double check these between two reliable sources. And when you're online, do watch for things that just repeat the same wording. You'll see a lot of cut and paste. That doesn't mean it's two different sources. It means the second source cut and pasted from the first. That doesn't mean it's necessarily factual. So there's some obvious ones. One of my favorites that we use all the time, literally more, not every day, multiple times a day, is archives. So whether that's the National Archives, Bibliothèque et Archives Canada, the Quebec or Nova Scotia Archives, Ontario, all the provinces and territories, I believe, have their own archives, and they are amazing sources of information, of images that can really help you visualize what things were like at a certain time, documents, maps, all kinds of amazing stuff. And just if you don't find what you want right away at first, just try changing your search terms around, add the word historic, try different spelling. You're going to run across what you need eventually. In fact, you might go down some really fascinating rabbit holes, even in the archives. Museums are another great source, whether it's a little museum in your home community or one of these bigger places. They've done a lot of research before they do their exhibitions, and before they've prepared the websites that go with that material. So they're pretty good places to go for information. Other online sources might include the Canadian Encyclopedia or the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. They are both very authoritative. Dictionary of Canadian Biography, aussi disponible en français. And obviously reading books. By the time a book gets to a reputable publisher, it's gone through a lot of fact checking and a lot of editing. Again, doesn't mean it's perfect. I've found a lot of discrepancies when I'm trying to check facts, but much more reliable than just, say, an online source that you don't really know who they are or where they're coming from. Your textbooks are a pretty good place to start. Keeping in mind that people think history is set for all time, and it's really not. Even in things like Kayak or Canada's History magazine, we're often finding things that we have to change because new information has come to light. The archives of Société Radio-Canada and the CBC are fantastic. They have videos, they have audio interviews. They are great places to go to learn more about the time, to see someone being interviewed. Same thing, obviously, with YouTube, as long as the sources that those are coming from are reliable. But for instance, we did a comic in Kayak about the famous Canadian racehorse Northern Dancer, and to see an actual video of its victory was pretty cool. And I've already mentioned these, but I would like to think that you can think of Kayak in Canada's history as maybe not perfect, but reliable sources for information. There's lots of other historic publications. I just mentioned a couple here. I don't think Capot Diamant is published anymore, but the archives will be useful. Legion magazine, chances are that your province or territory also has some kind of historic publication as well. Anything where somebody had to check facts before something could get published is more reliable than somebody just writing down their ideas on the internet. Honestly, it's not hard at all. As long as you take the time to respect the work of other people, and I really would encourage you to not just use somebody's information without crediting it, especially when it comes to images. Somebody took that photo, somebody created that artwork. So at least mention your sources and pay the respect to the people who did the original creation. One final source that's a bit more in depth, but the older students, you probably have access to databases through your school libraries. And those things, again, it can take a little bit of time playing around with search terms, but they have for instance, virtually every Canadian newspaper or magazine ever published. And those are amazing resources. They take a bit of time to go through, but periodical indexes, newspaper indexes, those things are fantastic. If not always necessarily for complete reliability. I know the newspapers where I live and most Canadian communities had a very strongly liberal newspaper and a strongly conservative newspaper, but they can be fun for showing you what the times were like, what people said about something at the time, and they can really add color to your research. So that's how simple it is. You just need to pay attention to the stories that are already all around you. Give some thought to what you like to do and how you like to tell stories, and then make sure that you create a framework of facts so that your stories can really live and have color and be meaningful to your audiences and help all of us understand a little bit more about what Canada is and how it got to be that way. Thanks so much, everybody. I would love to talk to you a bit more if you have specific questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that fascinating presentation. My name is Christine Jean-Genier. I'm a grade 12 student from Ottawa, Ontario, and I am so excited for you all to join us today and would like to open the floor to any questions for the next 20 minutes. Please send us any of your questions using the Q&A box. So I can see there's already one question there. So the first question is, how do you balance fact and fiction when you are using real life historical figures in more creative pieces? Is there anything we should be wary of or ways that we should or shouldn't approach it?
That's actually a really great point, especially when it comes to things like fiction stories or poems or a graphic novel. I think it's really important to respect the real person behind that story. And I think it's okay to take some liberty to put your words in their mouth. That's fine. If it's a real person, it is really important that you're faithful to what you've learned about them and the kinds of things they might say. So in Kayak, I often put a little note that says, we invented these characters, but this person is real. And so that people understand that we are taking the historical foundation and building on it. So it might be easier sometimes to invent a character like we did in that story about the Halifax explosion, for instance. We invented 2 young characters. But if it's a real historical person, that doesn't mean you can't write about them. That doesn't mean you can't imagine what they would say, but you do have to be faithful to your research and what you've learned about them. So let me see if I have some examples here of say, well, here's someone, for instance. This was a comic we did recently for our issue about newspapers, and it was a real Canadian reporter named Kit Coleman. She was the first woman who was, I think, authorized as a foreign correspondent. And I happen to remember back in my days in journalism school that one of my professors had written a book about her. So that's how the name Kit Coleman stuck in my head. So yes, we invented almost all of the dialogue, but to my mind, staying true to who I picture her being and mentioning that, yes, we had invented those stories. So it's even okay to use language that person might not use because you want a modern audience to understand it. Everybody knows that you're making up this person, but be respectful, be factual, and build on that to guide you when you're creating that character. Or like I say, invent somebody brand new that and put them in that setting and explore what they might think.
Thank you for that. Another question is, do we have to write about Canadian history?
If it's specifically for this contest, I think it's fair to say, I mean, we maybe part of the issue there is thinking about like history, right? Stories of the past are histories. So I think that's the idea behind the contest. And I don't know if Brooke is available to chime in or if anybody wants to add that in the chat.
Yeah, I'll just hop in and say, yes, for the purpose of the Our Stories, Our Voices program, it does need to be Canadian history, but I actually see you added a second bit to that. And they were saying, because I was thinking of writing about something baseball related. So Nancy, maybe you could kind of say how you would take a topic such as baseball, but apply the Canadian angle for the subject matter.
You picked a great subject for me because I love baseball, and I wrote a piece for Canada's History a few years ago, and it was called 9 Innings of Canadian Baseball. And I'd been to some baseball history conferences and picked up some really neat stories there. So as with anything, I would say go specific. So there is so much baseball history in Canada, it kind of gets buried by the hockey stuff. But there are like all those women who had played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. The first recorded game of baseball that we have an authoritative record for was played in Ontario. Babe Ruth hit his first home run in Toronto. There are so many Canadians who've played in Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson, who was the first Black player in the Major League Baseball, he started his professional career in Montreal. Something as recent as 20 years ago is history. So the Blue Jays or the Expos, when they first started playing, or the Expos had to move, were sold and moved to Washington. All of those things have a story. But with anything, go specific. Don't write about, I would suggest, don't write about Canadian baseball, write about a person, write about an event, write about a specific game, write about an inning. Maybe from the point of view of the kid who fished that home run out of the ballpark after the guy who became Babe Ruth hit it, because he wasn't so famous then. The more specific you can be, the more powerful the result is going to be in the end. So I would encourage you not to try to write the whole story of the War of 1812, but maybe you want to write about Laura Secord, or maybe you want to write about some of a specific battle, because there are some amazing stories when you get into the details. But if you keep it general, it will never be quite as satisfying or quite as engaging for the person who's reading it or watching the video or listening to it. So just read, ask questions, go to the Baseball Hall of Fame in St. Mary's, Ontario, if that's even a possibility, and you're going to find very specific things that interest you. They have the home plate from the year the Blue Jays won the World Series. So I don't know, what if you told that story about the Blue Jays World Series win from the point of view of the umpire, or you did a bande dessinée about, what if famous players from the past were able to watch that game. There's a million ways you could approach that story that's going to, like I say, just come back to what interests you. That's going to make your story more interesting to your audience. And don't think about history as being all famous great white men and military history and political history. It's your stories, it's your community, it's the things that interest you. There is a history behind every one of those things.
I really love your answer for that. Thank you so much. So we're getting questions about writing on myths. How would you approach that exactly?
Sorry, I missed one key word there about writing.
Sorry, so we're getting questions about writing on myths. So I was just wondering, how would you approach that?
Okay, so it depends what you talk about with myth. I think an important lesson that I have learned when it comes to, and I don't want to suggest that Indigenous knowledge and teachings are myths, but some people use that word, so I just want to make that clear. If it's not from your own background, I think you need to ask yourself very carefully about whether you're the right person to tell that story. It's totally, if you just think about that, because it's something I've learned, and we've changed our approach at Kayak, which is particularly if it's going to be about a piece of knowledge that is not from my background particularly, and I mean this specifically when it comes to First Nations or Inuit or Métis knowledge, that is up to those people to write, not me. So we work at, for instance, in an issue we have coming up about maps and finding your way around. I had an amazing conversation with an Inuit man who has built Inukshuk all over the world. And so he told me the story of the Inukshuk, and then I used his words in the magazine. So if you're thinking about myth in that way, just wanted to kind of mention that as something to be careful of. That said, if there's sort of folk tales or things that are kind of in the common understanding, maybe it's Norse legend, or like I say, French Canadian folk tales, or different parts of Canada have different stories. I mean, good heavens, Newfoundland is, they're right in the soil and in the air. I think those are really neat ways to explore what people believed and how that helps shape who we are as Canadians. It's obviously not historical fact, so that's really up to you to decide where that fits in terms of history. Is it myth that helped shape our history, that had a relevance to it, help shape how people think about it? There's some neat things in Manitoba about beliefs about, I think it's the Hulda folk, the little people that live in certain areas and might prompt you to not build your house there. There's some really neat stories around Canada, and just think about whether you consider them history or how they fit into this idea of the history, or Canada's history, or before Canada was a country, the history of that. Is it your story to tell, and how does it relate to history? And I would say go for it, because there are some pretty amazing ideas about different folk tales and stories that are still lingering in a lot of places, and they would be some very interesting subject matter, I would think.
I definitely agree with you on that. So another question is, how could you choose one topic when you like a few different ones and are having a hard time choosing?
That's a great sign that there are lots that interest you. I would just pay attention to which one gets you the most excited. Which one do you find yourself really wanting to know more about and learn more about? And if they're all equal in that respect, then picture yourself writing about it, or creating a video or a podcast or a poem or an essay or a comic, and then think about, okay, yeah, that would be really fun to do that way. I would just pay attention to that, honestly, and then which one, if you're really drawn to a particular format and you think, I'd really like to try doing a comic, a bande dessinée, then which story fits that better? Because there's no wrong answer, right? So you might as well pick the one that you like the most, that you can find the most information on, and that is really engaging you. What's the story that really wants to be told? And tell that one.
And another question we have is, why is it important to learn about history?
So many reasons, right? And if nothing else, let's think about what a lot of us learned and the knowledge that was confirmed for other people about what happened to a lot of children at residential schools, Indian residential schools in our past. There are a lot of us who didn't know those stories, and it's a shame that we didn't. But when people my age are in government and they're making decisions and they don't know those stories, then they're going to make totally different decisions than if they understand what the process of colonialism has done. When they begin to understand the harm inflicted by residential schools, then they might see the realities of present day Indigenous communities completely differently, because they know some of the stories about why that came to be, that it didn't just, there's nothing just completely natural about it. I look at my own area here, and there are people who say, oh, well, there's no First Nations people who live here. Well, first of all, there are, but it's not like where my sister lives on Vancouver Island, where it's unceded territory. It was never covered by a treaty. Her kids go to school with Indigenous kids. It's a totally different situation. So people here make a lot of different assumptions about what Canada means and how it got that way, because we don't think at all about the treaties that have covered this area and what that meant for Indigenous people, what the railway meant, what the colonization roads meant. So that's one really important issue, because if we don't know those things, we're not going to make good decisions about how to make Canada the country that it should be. So that's, to me, a really critical thing. Also, it's just really cool. It just helps us understand more about each other. And like I say, this doesn't have to be the huge sweeping issues or the famous people. Those are all interesting and important, but the story of how the Vietnamese, they were known as boat people at the time, refugees, came to Canada, and how they've enriched Canadian communities. that's a really important thing when it comes to understanding what Canada is. So it's really easy to say Canada is this, it's maybe it's just two founding peoples, or it's this story, or it's that story. But if we don't listen to a broad range of stories, we're not going to understand each other. We're not going to build a caring and a country that's aware of who it is and how it got that way. Because if we don't know those stories, we're just going to say, oh yeah, well, it's completely natural that there are no First Nations people here in this area where I live. Oh, they were put on reserves. Oh, their land was taken away. Oh, so they did live here. Okay. So what, oh, and their parents were terrified and they used to hide them out in the fields when the police came around to take them to school. Oh, okay. So that gives me a very different perspective on where I live, that there's nothing natural or automatic about things being the way they are. There's a reason why they got that way. There's a reason why Toronto's probably the most multicultural city on the face of the earth. That's pretty interesting. How are we going to live together? What stories do we need to know to understand each other a little better? As you can tell, I'm not somebody who studied history. I was just always kind of interested in it. But it's the stories that keep me interested, because we need to know these things to live together, to create a country where everybody has a place and is respected, and where we can share our strengths, which can only make a better country and better individual communities, right down to better schools, better villages, better municipalities, better families. The more we know our family's history, the more we know where we're going. And the same thing is true at every level of our country. It is also just the source of really interesting stories that are unique to us. No other country has a history that's quite like ours. So the more we know about that, the more we know about who we are, and we stop defining ourselves as being not American or not European. We're Canadian, and we have a very distinct, really, really interesting story to tell. It's not one story, it's as many stories as you can imagine.
Yeah, for sure. It gets pretty interesting the more you look into it. So another question we also have is, what is a good way to start writing a story that will really hook a reader?
So I don't know if you mean literally like how to start like the opening paragraph of a story, or how to marshal your thoughts for a story. So I'll talk briefly about those. Again, I'm sorry to go back into this over and over again. My background in journalism taught me about the idea of a lead. So what's something that's really going to grab people? So enter the scene at the most interesting part, right? Don't start with, Nancy walked into the fort. She looked around at the stone building. It's like, no, go right into the conversation, go right into the surprise, the thing that jumped out from behind the door or whatever. Start there. Start in the middle of something. You don't have to build up to things to start your story. You can always go back then and explain it after you've got that very exciting. In journalism, it's called a lead. But in your story, if you're writing a story, you really want that really fascinating, cool thing that's going to catch people's attention right away. So maybe it's a crash, maybe it's somebody going, waking up suddenly as their ship hits a rock. So go into the middle of the scene. Don't start at the start of the scene. You don't have to do that. And if you, in terms of starting, as opposed to like, okay, I've got all this information, how do I start? Again, I keep coming back to the idea of what grabs you. Because if it grabs you, it's going to grab your reader or viewer. So pick that thing, find the detail. And again, I can't stress this often enough, just because it's something I've learned kind of the hard way with experience. Be specific. Forget about the great big picture. That's your background. What's really going to make a story or a video or a poem fascinating is the specifics. So the conversations, the personal events, the emotion, the impact, the little thing that I like to think of as the doorway into the bigger story. You don't have to tell the whole story of the environmental movement. You can pick one thing. You can pick one protest that interests you. So the more specific you are, building on that research, that becomes your background. And those really fascinating people or events, that's what's really going to trigger a great story, because you're being specific and you're giving people something that they can latch onto and understand about this bigger issue that you're going to pick the fascinating person about, the goat that served in the First World War. That's a pretty great way to get into the First World War. Or maybe it's the person who rode in Flanders Fields, right? Those are the things that connect us to these bigger stories. You're welcome to tell the big story if you want, but find the doorway into it. That's going to be the opening part of your story often. And it's also going to be the thing that allows you to get going on the actual creation process.
Thank you. And the last question is, did you start Kayak magazine? And if not, why did you join?
Oh, I did not start. There was another, I think there were 2 editors before me. Before that, I edited, among other things, a magazine for kids called Wild, which was about Canadian wildlife. So that was pretty interesting. And that came to a natural end, as jobs do. I'm what's called a freelancer. So I do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But I'd been a freelance writer and editor for quite a while. And a friend said, hey, have you seen this job at Kayak? And I was already a subscriber because my young sons were interested in the stories of Kayak. So I applied. I had a really fun interview with 2 very well-known historians, Tim Cook and Charlotte Gray. And I told them that the main thing was that I never wanted this information to feel like it was good for you. I didn't want anybody to read Kayak and go, think it was like a textbook or something. In fact, I took into the interview with me these books, Famous Dead Canadians, because they're kind of, they've got a little bit of a humorous edge to them. They're a little bit, I don't want to say snarky, but yeah, a little bit edgy. And I said, this is the kind of tone I want. I want us to be exploring things and finding those cool little bits and pieces, but I don't ever want it to be something that feels serious or important. I just want to offer different ways to think about the story of Canada and highlight these really cool, interesting people and events and places that make us who we are. And so that's kind of the goal that I've had all along with the idea of making sure that we try to bring in voices of people who haven't always been given as much attention in the story of Canada. So whether it's Japanese people whose property was taken away in the Second World War, but some men out of that who formed a really neat baseball team, back to baseball, I know, whether it was people who, women who didn't have the right to vote until, you know, a surprisingly short time ago. There are a lot of voices that we need to pay attention to, I think, in what we do so that we tell the full story of Canada. But that's not your job in this contest. Your job is to figure out what sparks your interest and find a creative way to tell it based on the facts that you're able to research. So I hope you have a great time putting your entries together, because you can tell I find Canadian history really fascinating and exciting, and it's a great way to unleash your creative talents to tell stories that really are an important part of who we are as Canadians. So I wish you all good things with your entries to the Our Stories, Our Voices contest.
Wow, thank you so much. That was a fantastic Q&A session. There were so many great questions put forward today. I'm feeling the buzz of energy. Thank you, Christine, so much for your help with today's Q&A. I hope you had a great day at school. I know it's always fun to bring in some students to help us with these events. So thank you so much. Nancy, I would also love to express my thanks to you for participating in today's event. You've definitely inspired me to take a closer look at the stories in my community and to look around my own backyard a little bit more for inspiration. And thank you for all of your tips and the fantastic advice that you've given and sharing all of your knowledge and experience. To all of the students and the teachers who are watching this in their classrooms or at home, thank you for joining us. I hope you leave today ready to begin your storytelling journeys and inspired to learn and share the histories that matter to you. We had lots of really great questions about the #OurStoriesOurVoices national contest. So I'm so excited to hear that you're looking forward to this and are considering what you could submit. You can find all of the details, the rules, the how to submit, all of that information is online at www.canadashistory.ca/ I think it's enter OSOV. But we're going to put the link in the chat box because that will be an easier way to share it. As a reminder, it's any creative response you want. So Nancy gave tons of ideas of what would work and ways you can do that. So check out or think about what you might want to do. The basic idea is that you can share about a historical person, place, event, or object that you think more Canadians should know about. So this can be a new project that you want to work on in the next couple of weeks, or it can be a project that you maybe have already done in this school year. So think about what you have and think about what you want to submit. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks.